My name is Bianca Lailia. I'm in my late 30s. For most of my adult life, I was introduced with titles that sounded solid and respectable. Wife, partner, operations consultant, the calm one in the room. People often describe me as composed, practical, measured. What they usually mean is quiet. I've always had a voice that doesn't compete for space. I don't interrupt. I don't escalate. I don't cry in public. In boardrooms, I'm the woman who listens longer than everyone else before speaking. In social settings, I'm the one refilling glasses, remembering anniversaries, and smoothing tension with a gentle redirect. It's interesting how easily that gets mistaken for fragility. There's a certain type of woman people think they understand instantly, especially when she smiles more than she protests. They assume her softness means she will bend. They assume her patience means she won't act. They assume that if she hasn't reacted yet, she won't react at all. My husband believed that too. This story isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive revenge. It's not about screaming matches or shattered plates. Nothing in my life broke loudly. It broke quietly, and it was rebuilt the same way. On the night of our anniversary dinner, a room filled with friends, wine glasses glowing under amber light, my husband decided to make an announcement. He framed it as honesty, as bravery, as a man stepping into his truth. He announced his affair. What he didn't know was that months before that dinner, in a different room, under different lighting, he had already signed something far more consequential. He bragged about leaving me, not realizing he had forfeited everything months ago. But this is not a story about catching someone cheating. It's about what happens when a woman who is underestimated decides to stop correcting people's assumptions. It's about how silence can become a strategy. It's about the difference between reacting and preparing. I won't tell you that I never felt hurt. I won't pretend I was above humiliation. I won't romanticize betrayal as a blessing. What I will offer you is honesty. Honesty about how small dismissals accumulate. Honesty about how invisibility can become leverage. Honesty about what it feels like to watch someone underestimate you in real time and let them. If you've ever been mistaken for weaker than you are, if you've ever been spoken over, explained away, or quietly sidelined, then perhaps you'll understand why sometimes the loudest power move is the one no one sees coming. Tell me, have you ever let someone underestimate you on purpose? To my husband, I was stability. To his friends, I was the good one. To his colleagues, I was impressive. But in a way that made him look even better, I was the woman who made everything seamless. The dinner reservations appeared, the tax filings were handled, the investments quietly diversified. Our home ran like a system, elegant, predictable, efficient. People complimented him on our life as if he had constructed it himself, and he let them. When they asked how he managed such a balance, career, marriage, financial growth, he would laugh modestly and say something like, "It's all about discipline." They never asked who built the discipline. I didn't correct them. At parties, I stood slightly behind his shoulder when he told stories. He was charismatic in a relaxed way, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He liked being admired. I understood that about him early on, so I became the amplifier. If someone praised his recent promotion, I'd gently add context that made him sound strategic. If someone asked about our property purchase, I'd say, he had great instincts about timing. I rarely mentioned that I had run the comparative market analysis for 6 months before we moved. It wasn't martyrdom. It felt like a partnership. In the first years of our marriage, I genuinely believed that strengthening him strengthened us. That visibility was a shared resource, that if one of us shone, the other naturally benefited. But something subtle began shifting long before dinner. At small gatherings, I noticed how often conversations redirected away from me. If I mentioned a project I was consulting on, someone would pivot back to asking him about his firm. If I shared a thought on market trends, he would gently rephrase it, as though translating my idea into something more authoritative. He never contradicted me directly. He just improved my statements. "Bianca's always thinking ahead," he'd say with a smile. That's why I trust her to handle the details. The details. It became a word that followed me everywhere. I handled the details. I managed the details. I was good with the details. No one realized that the details were the foundation. I remember one evening at a charity gala, a woman I barely knew squeezed my arm and said, "You're so lucky. He's going places." I smiled. What I wanted to say was, "So am I." But I didn't, because part of me still believed that being perceived as gentle was an advantage. That underestimation was a kind of invisibility cloak. If no one felt threatened by me, I could move freely. And maybe that was true. What I didn't realize then was how quickly invisibility can shift from strategy to erasure. At home, he grew more comfortable speaking over me in small ways. Not cruel, not loud, just subtle interruptions. Correcting dates I knew were accurate. Finishing my sentences incorrectly and moving on before I could adjust them. Each moment was small enough to ignore, so I did, because from the outside, our marriage looked strong, successful. enviable. We weren't the dramatic couple, we weren't volatile, we were stable. And stability earns applause. No one saw the gradual narrowing of space around me. No one saw how often I chose peace over precision. No one saw the mental notes I began keeping, not in anger, but in awareness. I was never invisible to myself. That's something important. Even when others overlooked me, I saw clearly what was happening. I saw how narratives were formed. I saw how roles get assigned in marriages without formal discussion. He became the visionary. I became the support system. And for a while, I accepted that. Not because I was weak, but because I was patient. The difference matters. The first real cut wasn't loud. There was no slamming door, no accusation, no late-night confession that shifted the temperature of the room. It happened on a Tuesday. We were hosting two of his colleagues for dinner. Men I'd met before, both ambitious, both loud in the way that people often mistake for confidence. I had spent the afternoon preparing, not extravagantly, just thoughtfully. The right wine, a balanced menu, a table that looked intentional without looking staged. Presentation matters. I've always understood that. During dessert, the conversation drifted toward investment strategy. One of the men mentioned a risky venture he was considering, something in tech infrastructure. He spoke with that familiar tone of someone who wants admiration more than advice. I listened. Then I asked 3 questions, calmly, precisely, about liquidity, about exposure, about exit timing. The room shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. He hesitated. He hadn't considered one of the angles I raised. My husband smiled, that soft, charming smile, and leaned forward. She reads too much, he said lightly. Bianca loves worst-case scenarios. Keeps me paranoid. They laughed. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even dismissive on the surface. It sounded affectionate, protective even, as though he were translating my seriousness into something cute. But I felt it, the redirection. Instead of engaging my point, he reframed it as personality, as a quirk, as caution bordering on anxiety. The colleague nodded, relieved. Ah, so you're the cautious one. I smiled back. I prefer the word prepared. But the conversation had already moved on. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the house quieted, I brought it up gently, not accusatory, just observational. You don't have to soften my points for other people, I said while folding a linen napkin. I can handle direct discussion. He looked surprised, almost confused. I wasn't softening anything, he replied. I was just keeping it light. You can be intense sometimes. Intense. It wasn't the first time he'd used that word. I nodded slowly. Do you think I was wrong? No, he said quickly. You're usually right. That's not the issue. There it was. Not wrong, just excessive. The implication wasn't that my thinking lacked value. It was that its expression needed moderation, that my clarity required buffering, that my precision made others uncomfortable. And comfort, apparently, mattered more than accuracy. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because I was hurt, though I was slightly, but because something subtle clicked into place. He wasn't dismissing me outright. He was diluting me. There's a difference. Overt disrespect is easier to confront. It has edges. You can point to it. You can name it. Dilution is harder. It's polite. It smiles. It tells you you're too much in gentle tones. It reassures you that your value exists, just not in its full form. The next morning, I replayed the dinner in my mind. Not obsessively, analytically. This wasn't about ego. I didn't need applause. But I noticed something. He had enjoyed the laughter, the shift in attention, the moment when he rebalanced the room, where my insight became his narrative to manage. It gave him control. That was the first small cut, not the comment itself, but the realization that he preferred me was impressive in private and softened in public. I didn't confront him again about it. There was no point. He hadn't seen it as harm. To him, it was social smoothing, leadership, charm. To me, it was data. And I began collecting it, not in resentment, in awareness, because small cuts, left unexamined, have a way of teaching people how to treat you. And I was starting to understand the lesson being written around me. After that dinner, nothing changed, at least not visibly. We still hosted, still traveled, still posted anniversary photos that earned heart emojis and comments about how solid we looked together. If there was tension, it was microscopic, too small for anyone else to detect. And because it was small, I told myself it didn't matter. That's how normalization begins. The next time it happened was at brunch with another couple. I was telling a story about a consulting client who had nearly collapsed their own expansion by over-leveraging too quickly. It was an instructive story, not gossip, but a lesson about timing and ego. Halfway through, he interrupted. What Bianca means, he said smoothly, is that some founders get emotional about growth. That wasn't what I meant. I had been talking about structural impatience, about financial sequencing. It had nothing to do with emotion. But by the time I opened my mouth to clarify, our friends were already nodding at his version. He squeezed my knee under the table, a subtle signal, drop it. And I did. Because correcting him in front of others would feel adversarial, because I didn't want to look combative, because I didn't want to be intense. So I smiled and pivoted. That's the thing about repeated dismissals. They rarely escalate dramatically. They become patterns, predictable adjustments in conversation, a rhythm you begin to anticipate. He would rephrase, I would soften, the room would settle. Over time, I began pre-editing myself. Before speaking, I would filter my thoughts through a quieter lens. Is this too technical? Too direct? Too corrective? I started choosing simpler words, less precision, fewer follow-up questions. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I was managing comfort. His comfort, the room's comfort. The image of us is seamless and aligned. He never raised his voice at me, never insulted me outright, never told me I was less intelligent. But the subtext grew clearer. My intelligence was acceptable, as long as it didn't disrupt his spotlight. One evening, while reviewing some of our joint investment accounts, I noticed a misallocation. A subtle one. Nothing catastrophic, but inefficient. I pointed it out calmly. He leaned back in his chair. Do we have to optimize everything? He asked, half laughing. It's exhausting sometimes. Exhausting. That word lingered. Exhausting, to be precise. Exhausting to be strategic. Exhausting to be ahead. I closed the laptop. It's just what I'm trained to see. I know, he replied. And I appreciate it. I just don't want everything to feel like a performance review. That's when I understood something deeper. My competence made him feel evaluated. Not because I judged him. I didn't. But because clarity, when placed beside ego, can feel like criticism. So I began dimming strategically. I let small inaccuracies slide. I stopped correcting timelines and social settings. I allowed him to summarize decisions I had structured. And every time I chose silence, the pattern strengthened. People began attributing our financial success more openly to him. His confidence grew in proportion to my restraint. I watched it happen. Not resentfully, curiously. There's a strange power in observing a narrative form around you, especially when you know it isn't fully accurate. It's like watching a house being built on land you quietly own. The normalization of disrespect rarely feels like disrespect in the beginning. It feels like a compromise, like flexibility, like maturity. And I told myself that's what I was doing. Being mature, being supportive, being wise enough not to fight over small things. But small things accumulate, and eventually, the pattern stops being accidental. It becomes structural, and structures, once built, either protect you or contain you. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer improvising. You're performing, not theatrically, not consciously, but consistently. By the 8th year of our marriage, our dynamic had become so polished that even I could predict my own lines. I knew when to nod, when to laugh, when to fill in a logistical gap without drawing attention to it, and I knew when to disappear. At networking events, he would take the lead in introductions. This is my wife, Bianca, he'd say warmly. She keeps everything running. It sounded like praise. It always did. But I began noticing what followed. People would smile at me with appreciation, the kind reserved for dependable systems, like you might smile at an elegant piece of software that never glitches. Useful, reliable, background. No one asked what I was building. They asked what I supported. Even when I mentioned my consulting work, it was framed as an extension of my personality rather than my expertise. Oh, she's very organized. She's amazing with numbers. She's detail-oriented. The language stayed small. Never strategic, never visionary. And slowly, without any formal conversation, I had been assigned a role. I was the stabilizer, the quiet backbone, the woman who ensured that his trajectory remained smooth. At home, that role became even clearer. He would talk about future expansions, a larger property, a second investment venture, maybe relocating for a more prestigious opportunity. I'm thinking long-term, he'd say, as if I wasn't. I noticed how often the pronoun shifted. I want. I'm planning. I've decided. When decisions required spreadsheets, risk assessments, or legal review, he'd casually slide them across the table toward me. You're better at this part. And I was. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a partner in vision and became the processor of it. I handled feasibility. He handled visibility. I remember one afternoon standing in our kitchen, watching sunlight spill across the marble countertops I had negotiated the contractor down to afford. He was on a call in his office, voice confident, discussing our recent property acquisition. He didn't mention that I had found the listing, or structured the offer, or flagged the zoning nuance that saved us from a costly oversight. He wasn't malicious. That's what makes this story complicated. He genuinely believed we were aligned, that our dynamic worked. I preferred the background because I excelled there. And maybe part of me had helped him believe that, because I rarely corrected the narrative. The role of the stabilizer comes with a quiet reward, indispensability. When you manage everything behind the scenes, people rely on you. They assume you'll continue. They assume you won't disrupt the machine you helped build. But here's what no one tells you. Indispensable is not the same as irreplaceable. You can be essential to the system, and still be taken for granted inside it. The realization didn't come as anger, it came as clarity. One evening, after another event where I had been introduced as the organized one, I caught my reflection in the mirror while removing my earrings. I looked composed, polished, controlled. But I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I stopped doing all of this, the smoothing, the calculating, the anticipating, who would they think I was? And more importantly, who would he become without it? That was the first time I understood the role wasn't just assigned. It was expected, and expectations, once set, become cages if you never test the lock. It didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a betrayal. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in my car outside a cafe downtown, waiting for a client who was running late. The engine was off. The city noise filtered softly through the glass. Distant sirens, footsteps, fragments of conversation. I had 30 unplanned minutes, and for the first time in a long time, there was no one to perform for, no one to anticipate, no one to manage, just silence. I opened my email and saw a notification from one of our joint accounts, a transfer he hadn't mentioned. Not alarming, not catastrophic, but unnecessary, poorly timed. I stared at the screen longer than the situation required. Then I closed it, and instead of feeling irritated, which would have been the expected reaction, I felt something else. Distance. Not emotional withdrawal, not resentment. Perspective. For years, I had been reacting in micro-adjustments, softening, correcting, absorbing, rationalizing. Each moment is small enough to dismiss, but collectively shapes the architecture of our marriage. And suddenly I saw it from above. Not as a series of isolated conversations, but as a pattern. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't reckless, but he was comfortable. Comfortable being the visible one. Comfortable assuming I would study every risk. Comfortable believing I would remain loyal to the structure, no matter how uneven it became. I realized something uncomfortable about myself in that parked car. I had trained him to believe that, not intentionally, but consistently. Every time I chose harmony over correction. Every time I pre-edited my competence. Every time I absorbed a subtle dismissal to avoid tension. I had reinforced the story that I would always prioritize us over myself, even if us was slowly narrowing around me. That afternoon, I didn't cry. I didn't text him. I didn't draft a dramatic speech in my head. I did something quieter. I asked myself a question. If I removed emotion from this entirely, what would I do? Not what would I say? What would I do? The answer wasn't immediate, but the direction was. I would observe more carefully. I would document more thoroughly. I would stop correcting assumptions and start evaluating them. That was the shift. Not confrontation. Not retaliation. Strategy. Because once you see the full pattern, you stop responding to individual threads. You start examining the weave. I thought about our finances, our contracts, our joint ventures, the property titles, the operating agreements. I knew every detail, not casually, intimately. For years, I had handled the structures, reviewed the clauses, flagged the contingencies, and suddenly I understood something with startling clarity. If the balance of power in a relationship shifts quietly, the restoration of it doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be precise. My client eventually arrived. We had our meeting. I was articulate, focused, professional. No one would have guessed that anything inside me had realigned, but it had. That night, when my husband spoke about a new opportunity he was considering, I listened the way I always did, calmly, attentively. Only this time, I wasn't reinforcing the structure. I was studying it, and for the first time, my silence wasn't about peace. It was about positioning. After that Thursday, I didn't change outwardly. That's important. There was no visible withdrawal, no coldness, no sudden independence that might have triggered suspicion. If anything, I appeared steadier, softer, even more agreeable. Because this time, my silence wasn't reflexive. It was intentional. When he interrupted me at dinner the following week, I let him finish. Not because I felt dismissed, but because I was measuring something. How quickly would he assume authority over my unfinished thought? How comfortable was he doing it now? Very comfortable. I noticed he no longer even glanced at me afterward to check for agreement. The squeeze of the knee under the table was gone. He didn't need the reassurance. The dynamic had stabilized in his favor. Or so he believed. At home, I stopped offering unsolicited optimizations. If he allocated funds inefficiently, I waited. If he described a timeline that was overly ambitious, I didn't immediately adjust it. Not to sabotage, to observe. There's a difference between preventing a minor miscalculation and allowing someone to experience the edges of their own overconfidence. For years, I had buffered him from those edges. Now I simply stepped back half an inch. The first time a vendor deadline slipped because he hadn't confirmed details I normally handled, he was irritated. Not at me, in the situation. I thought that was sordid, he muttered. I looked up from my laptop. You said you wanted to take the lead on this one. Neutral tone, no accusation. He blinked, recalibrating. Right, yeah, I'll fix it. And he did, eventually. But I saw something subtle in his expression. the flicker of unfamiliar responsibility, the realization that seamlessness required effort he hadn't previously needed to expend. Silence, when strategic, is not passive. It creates space, and in that space, patterns become visible, not just to you, but to the other person. At social gatherings, I stopped amplifying his achievements. When someone praised his promotion, I simply smiled and let him elaborate on his own. I didn't supply context. I didn't reinforce his narrative. The room felt slightly different, not dramatically, but enough that he began filling more of it himself, talking longer, explaining more. Without my calibrations, his charisma edged closer to arrogance. He didn't notice, but others did. One evening after a dinner party, a mutual friend lingered in the hallway as guests left. She hugged me and said quietly, "You've been quiet tonight. Everything okay?" I smiled gently. "I'm just listening more." She studied me for a second longer than usual, then nodded. Listening more. That became my private mantra. Not because I lacked thoughts, but because I wanted unfiltered data. I reviewed our joint accounts more frequently. Not obsessively, methodically. I reread the operating agreements for our investments. I updated digital backups. I organized documents into categories he had never bothered to understand. If he noticed my increased diligence, he didn't comment. Why would he? In his mind, I had always been good with the details, and details rarely feel threatening. That was his mistake, because details are where leverage lives. Weeks passed, he grew more relaxed, more certain of his position. He began traveling more often for strategy meetings, networking dinners, conferences. I didn't question it. I asked practical questions about flights and itineraries. Offered to review contracts he was excited about signing. Maintained the appearance of the stabilizer. But internally, I had shifted roles. I was no longer the invisible backbone. I was the quiet archivist of our reality. And the more I listened, the clearer the architecture became. Silence had stopped being an accommodation. It had become aligned with me. Preparation never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like a woman at her dining table with a laptop open and a glass of water untouched beside her. It looks like someone is organizing folders, updating spreadsheets, reviewing clauses that were signed years ago. No one ever suspects the quiet one of building leverage. That's the advantage. I began with structure. Every joint asset we owned, property titles, brokerage accounts, partnership agreements, I reviewed them line by line, not because I expected disaster, but because clarity is power, and I wanted every variable mapped. I created a private archive, secure, duplicated, time-stamped, not hidden, just organized beyond casual access. Then I studied behavior. His travel had increased. That alone wasn't unusual. But the timing patterns were. Certain trips aligned suspiciously with the same city, the same extended weekends, the same vague explanations about last-minute networking opportunities. I didn't confront him. Confrontation reveals what you know. Observation expands it. Instead, I cross-referenced expenses, hotel bookings, transfers, minor discrepancies that would have escaped anyone less meticulous. And I documented everything. Not with outrage, with neutrality. There's something unsettling about realizing you're no longer emotionally reacting to what might be betrayal. It becomes an equation instead of a wound, a set of inputs leading toward an inevitable output. Around this time, I scheduled a routine meeting with our estate attorney, under the pretense of updating beneficiary information and reviewing tax exposure, which technically wasn't untrue. I asked questions carefully, hypothetically. If one partner were to exit the marriage unexpectedly, I inquired calmly, how would existing postnuptial agreements be interpreted? He adjusted his glasses and walked me through scenarios. I listened, because months earlier, long before any dinner announcement, I had suggested we sign a postnuptial agreement. I framed it as protection, strategic planning, safeguarding both of us as our assets expanded. He had agreed easily. Why wouldn't he? In his mind, I was risk-averse, detail-focused, protective of structure. Signing documents was my domain. He skimmed it, trusted my summary, signed where indicated. What he didn't register was the clause triggered by infidelity, the clause that preserved premarital assets and reallocated shared growth based on documented breach. The clause was written in language so neutral, it felt procedural. I didn't hide it. I just didn't dramatize it. Back at home, I updated our financial software access permissions. Subtle adjustments. Alerts are routed to me. Notifications archived. He didn't notice. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing had changed. I was still the reliable one, the organized one, the woman who handled the details so he could focus on vision. Friends continued praising our stability. Social media reflected curated harmony. He spoke more confidently about future expansions, sometimes even hinting at personal growth and evolving priorities. I heard subtext where others heard ambition. One evening, while he showered before another trip, his phone buzzed on the dresser. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I already knew enough. That's the part people misunderstand about preparation. They assume it's fueled by rage. Mine wasn't. It was fueled by inevitability. When someone grows comfortable underestimating you, they begin revealing themselves carelessly. He thought I was quiet because I was compliant. He never considered that I might be quiet because I was calculating timelines. By the time he began speaking more boldly about needing change in subtle conversations with friends, the structural reality of our marriage was already different. He just didn't know it yet, and I didn't correct him, because sometimes the most powerful position isn't the one where you expose the truth immediately. It's the one where you allow someone to walk confidently toward the consequences they signed themselves up for. The confirmation didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived in the form of a receipt. A boutique hotel in Chicago. 2 nights. A suite upgrade. Paid with a joint card he rarely used for travel because he preferred accumulating points on his personal one. That was the detail that mattered. Carelessness is rarely dramatic. It's subtle. A shift in habit. A deviation from the pattern. I didn't confront him. Instead, I cross-referenced the date with his calendar. Investor dinner. That's what he had told me. I looked at the timestamp on the charge. Mid-afternoon check-in. Champagne service was added to the room. Not a dinner, a weekend. I sat at my desk, the house quiet around me, and felt something settle rather than shatter. There was no racing heartbeat, no shaking hands, just clarity. I opened the postnuptial agreement, the digital copy, neatly filed months earlier. I reread the clause slowly, though I already knew it by memory. In the event of documented infidelity by either party, the non-breaching spouse retains full rights to premarital assets and is entitled to a disproportionate share of marital appreciation, as outlined in Appendix C. Appendix C was detailed, very detailed. I had written the framework alongside our attorney, carefully, fairly. At the time, I framed it as symmetry, protection for both of us, a recognition that as assets grow, so does complexity. He signed without hesitation. He even joked, "You and your contingency plans?" I smiled then. Now, months later, I felt no triumph, only confirmation that preparation is not paranoia. It's foresight. Over the next week, I gathered what I needed. Travel records, financial statements, a screenshot of a social media post from a woman who had tagged the same hotel lobby on the same weekend. Her caption vague, but time-stamped. I didn't spiral. I didn't investigate obsessively. I gathered enough, because leverage isn't built on emotion. It's built on sufficiency. One evening, he returned from another conference, more energized than usual. He spoke about expansion, about how he was reevaluating priorities. I watched him as he poured himself a drink. The confidence, the slight detachment, the way he seemed already halfway elsewhere. He thought he was ahead of me. That's what struck me most. He believed he was orchestrating an exit, that he would one day choose a moment, perhaps dramatic, perhaps framed as honesty, to announce that he had found something different. He believed he held the power of timing, but timing had already shifted. I scheduled a quiet follow-up meeting with our attorney. This time not hypothetical. I provided documentation. He reviewed it without commentary, simply nodding as he moved through the file. "It appears the clause is triggered," he said calmly. "If you choose to proceed." If you choose. That phrasing mattered. This wasn't automatic. It wasn't explosive. It was optional. I went home that afternoon and stood in our living room, sunlight stretching across the floor the way it had countless times before. Nothing looked different, but the architecture of our marriage had already changed. He just didn't know, and I felt no rush to tell him, because revelation is most powerful when it meets certainty. And I was almost there. There's a moment, after clarity, when the question is no longer, what happened? It becomes, what will I do with it? I had documentation, I had the clause, I had confirmation. What I didn't yet have was a decision. Contrary to what people imagine, leverage doesn't immediately produce action. It produces options. And options are heavy. For several nights, I lay awake, not in heartbreak, but in evaluation. I could confront him privately, show him what I know, offer him a path to transparency, attempt to renegotiate the emotional terms of our marriage. I could wait, allow him to make the announcement he seemed increasingly rehearsed for, preserve the image a little longer, or I could do something else entirely. I began separating emotion from outcome. If I confronted him immediately, he would pivot, minimize, perhaps confess partially, maybe even apologize. But apologies under pressure are rarely transformative. They are strategic. If I waited passively, I would surrender control of timing. And timing, I had come to understand, is power. The third option required the most discipline. Allow him to believe he was orchestrating his own exit. Allow him to grow confident enough to announce it publicly, and meet that announcement not with shock, but with structure. The idea wasn't about humiliation. It was about alignment. For years, he had underestimated my tolerance for long-term thinking. He believed I responded emotionally, that I was intense in bursts, but ultimately stabilizing. He assumed I would be blindsided by boldness. He didn't understand that I had already recalculated months ahead. One evening at dinner, he spoke more directly than usual. "I've been thinking about what I want in the next phase of my life," he said carefully. "Growth sometimes requires hard decisions." I met his eyes steadily. Growth always requires clarity. He studied me for a moment, perhaps expecting a flicker of insecurity. There was none, because by then, my decision was forming. Not from anger, not from revenge. From coherence. I would not argue for a role I had outgrown. I would not plead for space in a structure I had already outmaneuvered. If he wanted to announce a change publicly, if he wanted to frame departure as courage, I would let him. And then I would introduce reality, quietly. The anniversary dinner was approaching. He insisted on hosting something larger this year. Friends, colleagues, a celebration of how far we'd come. The irony didn't escape me. I agreed. I selected the venue, reviewed the menu, confirmed the guest list. He mistook my cooperation for ignorance, but cooperation and awareness are not opposites. They can exist simultaneously. The week before the dinner, I finalized paperwork with my attorney. Not filing yet, but prepared. Documents are organized in my black leather portfolio, copies secured, dates aligned. Everything precise. The night would unfold the way he imagined. He would believe he held the narrative. He would step into what he considered bravery, and I would step into something else. Not fury, not spectacle. Finality. Because once you understand that someone has already forfeited their position, legally, structurally, ethically, the only remaining question is when to let them realize it. I chose the irreversible path, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. That's the part people rarely see in stories like this. They imagine emotional buildup, confrontations in dimly lit rooms, sleepless nights fueled by anger. But what followed was administrative, measured, quiet. I met with my attorney twice that week. We reviewed asset allocations under the triggered clause. The language was precise, not punitive, simply structured. Premarital holdings remained mine. Marital appreciation would be recalculated based on breach. Certain joint ventures would revert to majority control under my management. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just what he had signed. I authorized preliminary filings but held them pending execution. Timing would matter. Service of documents would be coordinated strategically, not theatrically. At home, I continued preparing for the anniversary dinner. I approved the floral arrangements, confirmed seating placements, selected a dress that was elegant but understated, ivory silk, structured but soft. He interpreted my composure as obliviousness. There's a particular kind of confidence that grows in someone who believes they are about to shock you. He carried that energy all week, a subtle detachment, a rehearsed solemnity when he thought I wasn't looking. He believed he was building toward revelation. What he didn't know was that I had already rerouted the infrastructure beneath him. I reviewed our shared digital accounts one final time and ensured independent access to everything that mattered. I separated certain subscriptions, updated contact information with financial institutions, redirected official correspondence to a private mailbox I had secured months earlier. Not dramatically, just carefully. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the dinner, he mentioned casually, "I've been thinking about being honest with everyone. I don't want to live divided anymore." The phrasing was almost poetic. I looked up from my laptop. Honesty is always cleaner than performance. He studied my face, searching perhaps for fear. He didn't find any. He misread that as resignation. Silence, once again, was mistaken for weakness. The night before the event, I placed the finalized documents into my black leather portfolio. Not to wave them, not to brandish them, just to have them aligned with the evening's timeline. The venue was a private dining room overlooking the harbor. Warm lighting, long polished table. Enough guests to make an announcement feel significant, but not chaotic. He had chosen the scale intentionally. Big enough to witness, small enough to control, or so he thought. Saturday arrived with surprising calm. I moved through the day as I always did before hosting, confirming details, adjusting minor logistics, ensuring smoothness. He mistook my steadiness for dependence. But steadiness is not dependence. It's discipline. By the time we left for dinner, everything was in place. Legally, financially, strategically. There was nothing left to calculate. The consequences had already begun. They just hadn't been revealed yet. And as we walked into that candlelit room filled with people who believed they were attending a celebration, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not dread, relief. Because when preparation is complete, you no longer fear the moment. You simply wait for it to arrive. The dinner began exactly as planned. Wine poured, laughter rising in gentle waves, friends clinking glasses, complimenting the venue, commenting on how beautiful we looked together. We were seated at the center of the table, a symbolic placement, the couple at the heart of the celebration. He seemed almost serene. There's a specific composure people wear when they believe they are about to control a narrative. He had practiced his expression, reflective, brave. Halfway through the main course, he stood. The room softened, forks paused, conversations quieted. He raised his glass. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, he began, about growth, about honesty, about living authentically. The words were smooth, carefully rehearsed. He spoke about evolution, about how people sometimes grow in different directions, about courage, the courage to admit when something no longer fits. And then he said it. I've met someone. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, not chaotic, just a shift in air pressure. I didn't plan for this, he continued, but I can't ignore what I feel. Bianca deserves honesty. We both deserve happiness. There it was, the framing, noble, regretful, principled. He glanced at me then, perhaps expecting shock, tears, a trembling interruption. Instead, I placed my napkin neatly on the table. I stood. My voice, when I spoke, was steady, not raised, not cold, just clear. Thank you for your honesty, I said. Since we're sharing openly tonight, I'd like to clarify something as well. The room stilled further. I reached for my portfolio beside my chair, the same slim black leather case I carried to every meeting, every contract signing, every strategic review. I asked for a postnuptial agreement months ago, I continued. You signed it. It includes a clause regarding documented infidelity. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. A flicker, confusion before comprehension. I've already met with our attorney, I added calmly. The clause has been triggered. The filings are prepared. There was no accusation in my tone, no dramatic reveal of printed screenshots, no spectacle. Just information. Precise. The assets you've been publicly celebrating tonight were structured carefully, I said. The agreement protects them accordingly. Silence fell heavier than any shouting could have. He blinked, as if recalculating in real time. Bianca, this isn't the place. It's exactly the place, I replied gently. You chose it. I didn't elaborate further. I didn't list percentages. I didn't describe reallocations. That wasn't necessary, because the people at that table understood contracts. They understood structure. They understood consequences. And slowly, the narrative shifted. Not loudly, but visibly. He had intended to announce his departure as empowerment. Instead, he was learning that departure had already been anticipated, accounted for, legally structured. His confidence faltered in subtle ways. The glass in his hand lowered, his shoulders adjusted. No one spoke, because there was nothing theatrical to react to. No shouting, no tears, just a recalibration of reality. I sat back down, folded my hands. The dinner did not explode into chaos. It dissolved into uncomfortable quiet. Conversations resumed in fragments. Guests began checking their phones. One couple excused themselves early. Consequences rarely arrive with thunder. Sometimes they arrive in silence. And that night, the silence was heavier than any confrontation could have been. The ride home was quiet, not tense, not explosive, just hollow. He stared out the passenger window as the city lights blurred past. I drove, calmly, steadily, the same way I had driven us home from dozens of other events over the years. Except this time, the silence wasn't shared. It was separating. When we stepped into the house, he turned to me immediately. The composure he had worn at dinner was gone. In its place was something less familiar, uncertainty. What was that? He asked, not angrily, confused. That, I replied evenly, setting my keys on the console, was structure. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the living room. You blindsided me. The word almost made me smile. I didn't, I said gently. You just didn't read carefully. He stopped moving. Bianca, this doesn't have to turn into litigation. It already has, I answered. Not emotionally, legally. That's when the reality began settling in. Not the emotional betrayal. That had already occurred long before. But the tangible shift. The fact that what he had imagined as a dramatic exit was now procedural, binding, documented. I didn't think you would... He trailed off. What? React like this. There it was. The misunderstanding is laid bare. He had expected heartbreak, maybe pleading, maybe an attempt to negotiate affection back into place. He hadn't expected foresight. Right. I didn't react, I said calmly. I prepared. He sat down slowly, as if recalibrating his own memory. You planned this? No, I corrected. I planned protection. The rest followed your decisions. That distinction mattered. I hadn't engineered his affair. I hadn't orchestrated his announcement. I had simply accounted for the possibility. The same way I accounted for market volatility or contract disputes. He looked smaller then, not physically, energetically. For years, he had enjoyed being the visionary, the one who moved first, the one who controlled the direction. Now he was discovering that movement without awareness carries a cost. Can we undo it? He asked quietly. It wasn't about the affair anymore. It was about the agreement. I met his gaze steadily. No, not because I wanted punishment, but because reversals undermine integrity. The clause was clear. The documentation is sufficient. The filings are ready. Trust had already shifted. Structure had followed. He stood again, pacing. I didn't think it would go this far. I know, I replied softly. That was the truth. He hadn't thought beyond the moment of confession, beyond the imagined relief of stepping into something new. He hadn't calculated the downstream impact because, historically, I had absorbed it for him. But this time I hadn't absorbed. I had anticipated. He tried once more. We could renegotiate, reframe it, keep this private. It is private, I said. It's between us and the law. He looked at me then with something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not anger, not even regret fully formed. Recognition. Recognition that the woman he had framed as cautious and detail-oriented had just redefined the entire outcome. Panic, when it comes late, is quiet. It's not shouting. It's the realization that the window to control the narrative has closed. And that night, as he stood in a house whose structure I had meticulously secured, he finally understood something he had overlooked for years. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It waits, and when the moment arrives, it simply locks into place. The official papers were served 3 days later. Not at his office, not in front of colleagues. At home, quietly. He was in the kitchen when the courier arrived. He signed without suspicion, assuming it was another routine delivery. Only after the envelope was opened did the weight of it fully settle. He didn't shout. That surprised me. He read the first page standing up, then sat down slowly at the table, the same table where we had once mapped out 5-year plans and renovation budgets. You really went through with it, he said, almost to himself. I told you I would, I replied. The room was calm. Sunlight filtered in through the windows. Nothing in our environment reflected the magnitude of the shift occurring inside it. That's the nature of real endings. They don't distort reality. They redefine it quietly. He looked up at me. You never said you were this unhappy. I wasn't, I answered truthfully. I was observant. He frowned, trying to reconcile that distinction. You could have talked to me. I did, I said gently. In smaller ways, for years. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. I thought you were fine. I know. That sentence carried more history than any accusation could. He had mistaken composure for contentment, adaptability for acceptance, silence for surrender. I didn't think you'd protect yourself like this, he admitted. I held his gaze. That's the part you miscalculated. There was no satisfaction in saying it, only clarity. He rubbed his temples. Do you even care? The question wasn't about money anymore. It was about emotion. Yes, I said quietly. I care enough not to stay where I'm diminished. That landed, not as an attack, as a fact. He studied the documents again, more carefully this time. The percentages, the clauses, the reallocation of certain investments back under my sole control. The protection of premarital assets. I thought the agreement was mutual, he said slowly. It was, I replied. The terms applied to both of us. He nodded once, acknowledging the fairness, even if he disliked the outcome. There's a unique kind of confrontation that contains no raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, just the presentation of reality in its final form. That was this moment. He stood eventually and walked toward the window. I didn't think you were capable of this. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. That's been clear for a while. He turned back to me, and for the first time since the dinner, there was no defensiveness, no bravado, just understanding. Understanding that I hadn't reacted impulsively. Understanding that the shift had been in motion for months. Understanding that he had mistaken quiet for powerless. There was nothing left to argue. The structure was in place, the filings were submitted, the separation is underway. And in that calm kitchen, with sunlight falling across legal documents instead of celebration plans, we both finally saw the same truth. This wasn't revenge. It was a consequence. Delivered without heat. It has been 11 months since that dinner. The house is quieter now. Not emptier, just quieter. There's a difference. The legal process concluded efficiently, cleanly. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no public spectacle. Just signatures, recalculations, transfers, structure dissolving and reforming in a different configuration. I kept the property, the primary investments. My premarital portfolio remained untouched, exactly as the agreement specified. He retained what was proportionate under the clause, fair, but significantly less than what he once assumed was guaranteed. People ask, gently, how I'm holding up. I tell them the truth. I'm stable, not because I avoided pain, but because I faced it early, in fragments, before it became catastrophic. The first few weeks after everything formalized were unexpectedly still. No calls to manage, no calendars to coordinate, no anticipatory adjustments. For years, my energy had flowed outward, calibrating, optimizing, smoothing. When that current stopped, I had to redirect it. I began consulting independently, rather than attaching my work to shared ventures. I accepted projects that required public visibility instead of background precision. I spoke at 2 small industry panels, something I had previously declined because it conflicted with his schedule. The first time I stood alone at a podium and introduced myself without relational context, I felt something unfamiliar. Not validation, integration. My intelligence no longer needed softening. My voice didn't require translation. My caution wasn't reframed as intensity. It simply existed. There are evenings now when I sit at the same dining table and review contracts, but they are mine. My ventures, my negotiations, my growth trajectory. And I've noticed something subtle. When you stop compressing yourself to preserve someone else's comfort, your presence expands naturally. Not aggressively, not competitively. Organically. I don't speak more loudly than before. I don't dominate rooms. But when I speak, I don't pre-edit. Friends who once saw me as the quiet stabilizer now ask for advice directly. Not through him, not adjacent to him, directly. And I've realized something important. I was never invisible. I was strategic. The difference is choice. Back then, I chose silence to maintain harmony. Now, I choose clarity to maintain alignment with myself. There's no bitterness in me, no lingering desire to prove anything to him. In fact, we've spoken a handful of times since everything was finalized. The conversations are civil, controlled, almost reflective. He once told me, "I didn't know you were that far ahead." I answered honestly, "You never asked?" Identity is a quiet reconstruction. It's not a dramatic reinvention. It's the gradual removal of constraints you didn't realize you were accommodating. Who I am now isn't harsher. It's simply unfiltered. And the most surprising part, I don't feel powerful. I feel proportionate, aligned with my own capacity instead of adjusting it for someone else's narrative. For years, I believed strength meant supporting the structure we built together. Now I understand something deeper. Strength is knowing when you've already built enough to stand alone. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that power doesn't announce itself. It prepares. For years, I thought loyalty meant endurance. That partnership meant smoothing every imbalance before it became visible. I believed that being calm was synonymous with being compliant. It isn't. Calm can be calculated. Silence can be a strategy. Patience can be positioning. When my husband announced his affair at our anniversary dinner, he believed he was reclaiming control of his life. He believed he was stepping into honesty with dramatic courage. What he didn't realize was that courage without foresight is simply exposure. He bragged about leaving me, not realizing he had forfeited everything months ago. Not because I punished him, because he signed an agreement he didn't think he would ever trigger it. Because he underestimated the woman sitting beside him. Because he confused quiet with powerless. This story isn't about winning. It's about awareness. There's a difference between reacting to betrayal and preparing for the possibility. One is emotional, the other is structural. I didn't scream, I didn't humiliate, I didn't destroy. I aligned the outcome with the truth. And sometimes, that is the most dominant act of all. If you're listening to this and you've ever been underestimated, at work, in a relationship, in your own family, I want you to remember something simple. You don't have to announce your strength for it to exist. You don't have to prove your intelligence by raising your voice. And you don't have to remain in a role that diminishes you simply because you've played it well for years. Preparation is not paranoia. Boundaries are not cruel. And quiet women are not unaware. Sometimes the strongest move isn't confronting someone the moment they cross a line. It's letting them walk far enough to reveal exactly who they are and ensuring you've already secured your position before they do. So I'll leave you with this question. If someone in your life is underestimating you right now, are you reacting or are you preparing?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.